Do you seriously consider museums to be temples of truth? Wake up. These are global institutions for the censorship of our memory. In reality, they are giant black holes where anything not entered into a database officially never existed, which means it can be stolen, burned, or replaced without a single witness. For decades, we have been fed the myth of careful heritage preservation, but behind the armored glass of display cases lies either total chaos or a cold calculation based on our ignorance. What you see in the halls is only a tiny fraction of reality, passed through the rigid sieve of someone else's interests. True history gathers dust in crates that haven't been opened for centuries and in archives that are legally considered empty. The system is designed so that an object can sit on a shelf while not existing in the registry. And what is not on the list cannot be found, cannot be studied, and, most terrifyingly, its very existence cannot be proven. We trust museums to interpret the past, unaware that they have become monopolists on the right to decide what we remember and what must be ground into dust. To realize the scale of this systemic fraud, one only needs to look at a tiny stone the size of a fingernail. This nondescript artifact lanced the abscess in the world's most guarded treasury, proving that stealing history is much easier than you think. 2,000 priceless treasures evaporated from the British Museum, and the security system didn't even flinch. How do you loot the most protected building on the planet? Simply steal what officially doesn't exist. For 20 years, curator Peter Higgs methodically plundered the storerooms, tossing ancient masterpieces onto eBay for the price of a diner lunch. Gold rings and unique gems went under the hammer for pennies, while the administration remained in a lethargic slumber. The secret lies in the accession backlog. These items had physically sat in museum crates for 200 years, but no one had bothered to enter them into the digital registry. In the reality of the database, they simply weren't there. When an investigative collector literally rubbed the management's nose in the stolen lots, they replied with icy arrogance, "We do not have this property." And they weren't lying. Legally, it is impossible to steal a phantom. Objects vanished into the void because the system only saw what was convenient for it to account for. But Higgs is merely a symptom. The real catastrophe lies in the numbers. The British Museum displays less than 1% of its collection. As for the other millions of objects in the black zones of the storerooms, not even the management knows what is happening to them. Do you think you've bought a ticket to a treasury? No, you've bought a ticket to the antechamber. True history is locked away in concrete crypts that have become mass graves for millions of pieces of evidence from our past. The numbers are a death sentence for common sense. The Smithsonian Institution houses 157 million objects, yet you, as a mere mortal, are permitted to see less than 1%. The Hermitage hides 97% of its collection. The Louvre generously displays 10%, leaving everything else to rot in the darkness. This is not a lack of space, it is informational castration. Museums have turned into giant ghettos where autocratic curators decide which part of history is worthy of your gaze and which must vanish into dusty boxes. Millions of items go unseen for years simply because they do not fit the current agenda or are inconvenient for the official chronology. We are dealing with a monopoly on reality. A handful of administrators hold the heritage of humanity hostage, feeding us only sterile crumbs from their table. But this golden percent in the display cases is merely a facade. The dirtiest work happens where the tour guide's authority ends and the unmarked crates begin. If an object isn't taken out of its box for years, how do you know it's still there and hasn't been replaced by a cheap copy? When empires become ashamed of their past, they don't apologize. They reach for a jerry can of gasoline. Heritage isn't about memory. It's the code name for the most massive cleanup of evidence in human history. In the 1950s, as the British flag began to fall across the globe, London launched Operation Legacy. The instructions were specific and ruthless: destroy everything that could embarrass Her Majesty or provide new governments with legal leverage. This wasn't a chaotic retreat, it was the planned liquidation of the truth. Tons of documents regarding torture in Kenya and punitive raids in Malaya were burned to powder, and the ashes were dumped into the oceans. In Uganda, stacks of papers were thrown into Lake Victoria. Officials signed destruction certificates. surreal receipts stating that the truth no longer existed. Instead of real archives, the colonies were handed dummy folders, filled with neutral garbage about rice purchases and the weather. The accounting system recorded its own emptying, creating an illusion of order where, in reality, a void gaped. But the empires made one fatal mistake. They didn't account for the fact that ashes sometimes know how to speak if you find the right place of their burial. Until 2011, the British government maintained a stony-faced denial. No such archive exists. That was until it was revealed that the closed Hanslope Park Centre was hiding over 1 million documents that officially did not exist in nature. This facility in Buckinghamshire is a literal black hole on the map of history. When lawyers and veterans of the Kenyan Mau Mau uprising finally backed the authorities into a corner in court, they reluctantly admitted, "Well, we have about 8,000 folders." But the lie unraveled instantly. Behind that pathetic pile of papers stood a colossal mass of 1,200,000 secret files. These were documents that had existed as legal ghosts for decades. They weren't in catalogues, they weren't released to researchers, they were simply deleted from reality. Why? Because they contained detailed protocols of physical coercion and orders that would make any international tribunal's blood run cold. Remember this mechanism. An absence from the registry protects secrets more reliably than any lock. An object or document for which a certificate of non-existence has been issued turns any crime into a myth that is impossible to prove in court. 4 generations of students took notes on these warriors as the greatest heritage of antiquity, until it was revealed. The masterpieces were slapped together by ordinary Italian scammers in 1914. In 1915, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York dropped a fortune on 3 terracotta giants. The full-length warrior and the colossal head were declared the pinnacle of Etruscan art. Curators sang their praises, textbooks printed their photos, and experts arrogantly silenced the skeptics. Yet the evidence was screaming for attention. Manganese dioxide, which the ancients never used, was found in the glaze, and the statues lacked the ventilation holes necessary for firing. Any apprentice potter would have realized they were fakes. But the museum administration held the line for 30 years. Their argument was lethal in its simplicity. The Met bought and verified it, therefore it is authentic. The authority of the brand became more important than chemical analysis or common sense. The system held together on a word of honor until 1961, when one of the forgers, Alfredo Fioravanti, walked into the museum and presented the proof. The bubble burst, but instead of admitting the collapse of their expertise, the museum employed the tactic of silent disappearance. When a lie becomes too obvious, objects are not destroyed, they are executed by silence. Welcome to the museum morgue, where evidence of forgery is hidden more securely than the gold in Fort Knox. Having admitted the shameful truth about the Etruscan fakes, the Metropolitan did not repent. It simply threw the warriors out of the halls and into a special storage facility that staff cynically call the morgue. And here lies the ultimate paradox. While the object was considered a masterpiece, it was available for public viewing and independent verification. As soon as it was recognized as a fake, access was restricted in the interest of scholarly security. Now, to see these idols, you must be a trusted associate of the administration and provide a compelling justification. The object wasn't just removed from sight, it was removed from all public oversight. It is a perfect tactic. If a problem cannot be solved, it must be isolated in a zone where there is no one left to ask questions. This is not the correction of an error, it is the preservation of a failure. Museums create entire graveyards of inconvenient objects that interfere with the official version of history. And the more skeletons there are in the closet, the less truth remains in the exhibition halls. Admitting a forgery means admitting that millions of dollars from trustees' pockets were squandered on a pile of modern brick. Do you think they are driven by a love of art? They are driven by a fear of an audit. Every purchase in a major museum is not just a scientific act, it is a financial transaction with a long tail. When the Met spent the annual budgets of entire departments on the Etruscan warriors, it created financial records that investors and grant makers believed in. If they admit that the expertise was a sham and the curators were overconfident dilettantes, the entire system of expert trust would collapse like a house of cards. This is exactly why the administration ignored chemical analyses and letters from Italian scientists for 30 years. It wasn't a scientific discussion. It was mutual cover-up and institutional self-defense. To admit a mistake is to wipe out the brand's capitalization. It is easier to feed the public lies than to jeopardize future funding tranches. The system's survival instinct is always stronger than the pull toward the truth. Lies in museums persist exactly as long as maintaining them remains cheaper than public disgrace and financial lawsuits from deceived donors. Go to the online catalogue of any top-tier museum in the world and look directly into the eyes of systemic chaos. Thousands of entries read, "Registration date not established," or "Provenance unknown." This is no accident. It is a legal method to erase the roots of any object. In 2019, the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History dropped an information bombshell. They admitted they had no idea where 30% of the human remains in their holdings came from. More than 3,000 objects are not just boxes on a shelf. They are the fates of people turned into nameless inventory. This is the standard mechanic of accumulation. Items arrived faster than they could be recorded, creating massive gray zones. In these conditions, any artifact hangs in limbo. It physically exists, but legally it has no history, no owner, and no rights. Such anonymity is the ideal breeding ground for manipulation. If an object has no biography in the registry, its replacement or disappearance will not trigger even a shadow of suspicion. We are used to believing that a museum grants objects immortality. In reality, it often grants them oblivion, stripping them of context and turning them into silent pieces of evidence that no one can use against the official version of history. The theft in London, the bonfires in Africa, and the fakes in New York. They have different motives, but the same signature. These are not a series of unfortunate mistakes. This is the work of a finely tuned mechanism for reality management. Look at these cases simultaneously: the negligence of a keeper at the British Museum, who simply didn't have time in 200 years to describe the crates; the state order from London to destroy incriminating evidence in Kenya; the vanity of the Metropolitan's curators protecting their reputation. Different people, different goals, but the result is identical. Whatever is removed from the registry or substituted within it ceases to be a part of history. The system always preserves the outer shell. Inventory numbers are in place, folders in archives are numbered, catalogue cards are filled. But inside, there is either a sucking void or a blatant lie. This is sterile documentation. To any inspector's request, the system produces a paper confirming that everything is in order, even if the crate contains construction debris instead of ancient gold. The most terrifying thing here is not the villains in the offices, but the ordinary people who are just doing their job. The sum of their small compromises, laziness, and compliance creates a global system that turns the past into modeling clay, from which any convenient version of the present can be molded. We live in a history that has passed through the fine sieve of censorship, laziness, and corruption. What you see in textbooks and display cases is not the truth, but merely the approved residue that they didn't have time to burn or steal. The 3 cases we examined surfaced only due to incredible coincidences: the vigilance of a single collector, the desperate lawsuit of veterans, and the belated confession of a forger. Remove any one of these links, and the gems would have continued to leak out of the British Museum. There would officially be not a single secret file in Hanslope Park, and the Etruscan warriors would still be considered the standard of antiquity. We only see the breaches in the system that it didn't manage to patch up in time. The true history of humanity is still locked in nameless crates and black archives, access to which is barred by the armored doors of institutional lies. We are shown a glossy version of the past, while the authentic artifacts turn to dust or settle in private safes. The truth is not in the display cases, it is in those folders that officially do not exist, and in those objects they have been afraid to take out of their boxes for years. Are you ready to admit that a large part of your past is a blank page that the system's administrators have filled with convenient fiction?